Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to the other speakers so far. So thank you for that. Apologies in advance if my thoughts are a little bit muddled. I'm going to share my screen, but I first have some comments, I think, from what was just said, very brief. So I think, yeah, it's really interesting because I haven't engaged as much in the experience of, Chinese, whether it's workers or entrepreneurs or SMEs in the continent, and the way in which that would compare to the experiences of Africans in China. So actually listening to Huairong and Yan Huairong and what she said has been really, really interesting. I think by way of comparison, while that comparison is necessary, I think also, especially from a community perspective, what we often do also is compare the experiences of our community in China and elsewhere also. So a lot of what I will touch on today will be that comparative process that happens internally and isn't often shared externally. I think the next thing I wanted to ask actually was about the profiling that happened in Zambia. I thought that was quite interesting, and I wanted to know about the origins of that, what the reasons are for profiling, why that takes place in a Zambian context for Chinese individuals, and that will probably lead on to something that I'll touch on in the presentation. I think the next thing that I wanted to say was that I really agreed with the idea of not a single experience. Actually, when we got started as a platform, the whole purpose behind it was actually to give a voice to the very different experiences that exist within our community. And I think, yeah, having that nuance and being able to look at them from their individual lenses, especially because our platform is Afro-diasporic also, really helps here. So yeah, I think what I'll do is I'll share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay. Right, so apologies for the overloading of text, but I thought it was really important to start with a conversation around racism in general and how we describe it, how we define it. I also thought, we don't exist very much in academic spaces. We're typically quite community-focused platform, and the gap in the conversation between the community and academic community is absolutely massive. So I just preface this with, this is not really a community pursuit. Finding an accurate definition for racism isn't really something that we do internally very often. And whether we should or not, that's a different conversation. But I think it's important to note, because there are a variety of racialized experiences that we do have that all are considered as racism. Personally, I don't have a problem with that, but seeing as we're in an academic space, I just wanted to start with this. There was a paper that I really enjoyed by Miri Song, who's an academic here where I currently am. And well, obviously everyone can read this, but I'll just read it anyway. So I think one thing that I took from it was just that, sometimes we do tend to put every racialized experience that we have into one category. And that can be something that, confuses the conversation slightly. I think also to add on to that, because racism is the strongest one in this category of all the different terminology that we use, if anyone suggests that something isn't racism, an experience that a group of people has, it can sound as if, you are devaluing that experience, or you're saying that it didn't happen. And I think that's the reason for a lot of sensitivity around racism and those who choose to call it out as not being racism or isn't, that conversation. But I think the crux of the argument here is, racism itself as a concept links onto ideas about superiority or inferiority, first and foremost. So discrimination itself linked to superiority and inferiority. So when we look at xenophobias that exists, for example, we did see this briefly on the continent, we've seen it in the Caribbean, obviously in the UK and the West as well. When they link back to some of the historical racist ideas about whether it's Chinese people being uncivilized or unclean, thus leading to disease, etc., this definitely has racist connotations in it, can be denoted as racism. Obviously, these ideas don't always come into play when it comes to understanding, or when it comes to anti-Chinese sentiments, but I thought that was important to note. Anti-Black racism, I really enjoyed Kun Huang's presentation and some of the thoughts that she mentioned around the concept of family. And I think that made me reflect quite a lot about whether we consider the idea of wanting to preserve an idea, at least about purity, about pure Chineseness, if you like, whether that is racist or not. And again, I brought it back to this question of superiority and inferiority, because there is ethnocentricity as well. And I just wanted to highlight that, this concept of having an endogamous family doesn't necessarily have to come from a racist place, but it can do. Again, linking back to that idea of superiority and inferiority. But the final thing to say on this slide is just that as a community, when we speak about these things, we don't make that distinction. Do we need to? I don't think we particularly do. They're still problematic wherever they come from, but it's useful in this academic context, I guess. Ignorance versus racism. So I think this conversation, it's interesting because there's this, and I was in a call yesterday that had the same topic come on. And I think there's often this desire to really separate anti-Blackness in the Chinese context from racism, because racism, and it's been mentioned here before, racism is a term that links back to the history of the West. And so there's that question mark about whether it's appropriate. But from within the African diaspora in China perspective, I wanted to note that there has always, and obviously this only dates back to 2016, but I actually found this very quickly. It's a paper that a friend of mine wrote, but there has always been pushback against this question of ignorance versus racism. And this is a really important example, both personally and more widely. So while I was at Peking, the Xiaobi ad came out, the advert that Kun Huang mentioned in her presentation. Obviously, everyone's familiar with it here. And, as students, I think the conversation, so for context, I was a member of the African Student Association, and obviously when these things happen, both the wider things that happen, because obviously the wider community, everyone outside of the African diaspora knows about the Xiaobi ad, but there are several incidents that constantly take place, not on a sporadic basis, that also kind of causes for concern within the community. But when this one happened in particular, again, because of how it was blown up, the conversation came out about ignorance versus racism, and Professor Lian Shan wrote a paper that suggested that it was all about ignorance, and ignorance is not the same as racism. And a paper was written by two members of the African Student Association at the time, which basically challenged this. And so these kind of articles have come up. We've written articles similarly to this, but it seems like we make the same argument and we stress why, from a perspective within the community, ignorance and racism, that argument is quite weak in some instances, but it falls on deaf ears. So I thought that was quite interesting, that this has come up again. Let me just move this out of the way quickly so I can see. And then the final thing I wanted to mention on this slide was just that comparisons that happen and take place between anti-Black racism in China and in the West, I think it's an interesting one because there are several different experiences within the community. One thing that we see often, and our co-manager, Saron, she's from Ethiopia, and she constantly mentions the fact that China was the first place that she lived in outside of Addis, right? So for many people, Chinese anti-Black racism is the first form of racism that they will ever experience. Not everyone, I think examples were given of people who were comparing London to China, or comparing, I think Paris I heard yesterday, to China, but not everyone will have had that experience to go anywhere else. And so their first taste of anti-Blackness, of anti-Black racism will be in China. And some view it as worse, not only for that reason, but also because it's almost a lack of expectation that racism will happen in a Chinese context. Knowledges of China, Chinese history, et cetera, differ on arrival for many. And so if you don't have an understanding of China, but you do have an understanding of the West and the history of the West, you would expect racism in a Western context. You might not expect it in a Chinese context. So yeah, there's definitely a gap. Right. So I wanted to speak again about understanding anti-Black racism in China and the differences there. I understand that the terminology that we're using comes from elsewhere, but it's interesting because, again, from community perspectives, and this comes from throughout like the 7 years of my time in China, really sitting in the WeChat groups that exist and having open conversation as a community, as a wider diaspora, and listening to the experiences that people are having and the similarities they share. And I think Yan Hairong had mentioned the similarities between, again, the Chinese diaspora in the continent and the African diaspora in China. And I just want to reposition slightly to look at the similarities between African experiences in China and elsewhere, so African diasporas elsewhere. And really, I think, for me, when we think about this idea of comparison and whether comparison is helpful or not, I think the shift that needs to take place, the power to make that shift happen lies very much with those in power. And so any comparison that does take place is because a lack of shift is happening at those higher levels. And so I wanted to give a few examples. Obviously, some people will be familiar with them, so I'll go through them quite quickly. But obviously, this is taken from Wolf Warrior. This is taken from Extraction. I think that's Chris Hemsworth. So, when we spoke about the 2018 Spring Festival Gala incident, a lot of people focused only on the blackface, and the blackface was one of the key issues, as well as obviously the stuffing of the buttocks and the stuffing of the chest. But outside of this, there was also the problematic narrative that lay in the script and what was being said on stage, and it was basically a continuation of a savior narrative. And so when we speak about, I think I've heard this not said today, but previously I've heard this said that, in some dialogue, Chineseness is replaced by whiteness. And I think, is it the case that people are replacing Chineseness with whiteness, or is it the case that in these contexts, deliberate narratives are being created that are basically copy-paste? And what I mean by that is basically borrowed narratives from elsewhere, playing out in this context, in this space. So this is one example, obviously. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this here, but I thought this was interesting. It's been something that I've been looking into as an investigation, but this is, so currently I'm in the UK because of COVID, and this is Anthony Walker. He was, and this comes back to the concept of the endogamous family that I think Kun had mentioned earlier. And he essentially was killed in the UK at the turn of the millennium, 2005, because he was walking on the street with a girlfriend, a white girlfriend, a British white English girlfriend. And I thought it was interesting because there have been instances, not the one that was a myth and that kind of circulated around the time of Guangzhou 2020 incidences, but there have been instances of people that I know personally being attacked for, you know, being with their partners who are Chinese. So I just wanted to highlight this because I think these phenomena do exist, whether they in both places. And I think comparing them in this context is important, because otherwise what tends to happen is that there's this approach that suggests that things are a lot better in China, which in some ways it is, but there still are problems. And I think also we've got to remember that the power dynamic that exists in a Chinese context is slightly different, in the sense that many people will have experiences that they don't feel comfortable sharing. That's actually how we ended up covering most of the Guangzhou incidents and the things that were happening, is because people would send their messages and their comments directly to us because they were scared of the ramifications of sharing anything on their own, you know, on their own behalf. Sorry, I think I'm going a bit slow, so I'll speed this up. But then finally, I just wanted to mention there's also examples of employment, housing, and policing. You know, we know the discrimination, well, hopefully everyone does know the discrimination that takes place in these incidents. And again, for those who have spent time in China and elsewhere, the similarities are quite stark. Yeah, this is the last thing I wanted to mention on this point, is the weaponizing of suffering almost. And this is something that was heavy in discussion at the time of Guangzhou incidents. And it was the way in which, and I think this was actually mentioned by Kun Huang. I was really appreciative of that, actually, and the acknowledgement of this, was the way in which, you know, as the two countries go against each other, China and the US, I mean, essentially African narratives don't really matter beyond, or African suffering rather doesn't really matter beyond the way it can be used to kind of throw mud at the other. And I think as a platform and as a group and as a community, this was one of the reasons why it was so necessary to develop a space for narratives that exist outside of these two lenses. I'm going to speed up quickly. I really enjoyed Kun Huang's piece, and the second article that I read, I think it was the one that you sent slightly later. And I thought about this conversation about solidarity, and it's been conversations we've been having quite regularly on Clubhouse since maybe February. Solidarity, what it looks like. I think we often put an emphasis on proximity, and what I mean by proximity is a need for us to quite literally physically come together. While I understand the importance of this, and I think there are some groups who are doing great work in this space, such as Kente and Silk. So Kente and Silk are the founders of the very first Africa Week in China. They hold really great sessions that kind of welcome younger Chinese to engage with the community. Their work is phenomenal. And they also do deep dive trips to various African countries. I think their first one was to Rwanda. So yeah, these spaces are necessary. They do serve a purpose. But I think we need to also look closer to home when it comes to the topic of solidarity and the conversations that we're having with our respective communities. So when I'm saying this, I'm speaking more to communities of African descent and also the wider Chinese diaspora and community. The reason for saying this is because we know that we do have our own individual biases and racisms, according to that definition I gave at the beginning, within our respective communities. And I think actually sometimes our solidarity is best shown by having these conversations internally, more so than anything else. And this was actually, again, this reflection came off the back of events that have happened in the States recently, and sitting in on hours of discussion amongst the Asian American community. and looking at, okay, how do we move forward in solidarity and take some of the burden off each other? And I think the most important one, especially for the African community in China, is actually that process. And the reason why I say that is because, again, there's that power dynamic. Many people are scared of speaking out. Even us as a platform, for the first year and a half in existence, we didn't used to use our real names. We didn't used to use any names. We just used to use the name of the platform. And yeah, I think by taking the burden off and having those conversations, or holding power to account on behalf of the communities that don't necessarily have that ability for themselves, that's one way to show solidarity. Understanding self-censorship, this is something that I think is really important going forward, actually, because I see a lot of people state that, and I've seen this in action twice on 2 separate occasions, but I see a lot of people state that they have been told X, Y, and Z by said African individual or person of African descent in China. And while I don't doubt that there are differences, and again, in the very first article that we ever wrote, we highlighted the differences in perspectives across the community. While I don't doubt that these differences do exist, I think it's important to understand the difference in conversation that happens internally, as in closed borders, when it's only people of African descent discussing, and the comfort levels that exist to engage with people on the outside. What I find really interesting is that as a community, sometimes there's not so much of a, well, in general, I think, and even if you look at what's happened across the world, there's not this separation between the Chinese individual and China as a country, and that's extremely problematic. But also what it means is that, you know, when people are approached for comment on certain things, because they see X individual as representative of Chineseness in general, or the Chinese state, there is still a self-censorship that takes place in terms of what you say and what you're willing to put forward. And the way that I realized this the most was during the Guangzhou incidents. Again, people were very, very fearful of saying anything. And we saw that some people had reason to be. You know, many people had visits by the police during this time. And what I would see was that some of the voices who actually ended up on Chinese TV saying, there's no racism, everything is fine, were the same ones to send content to me and say, this is disgusting, I can't speak about this, you do it. And that's what I mean by self-censorship. It's the outward kind of niceties and the inward honesties. Sorry, I'm close to the end. So allyship allyship. So outside of solidarity between the two communities, if we refer to them as two communities, I think it's more complex than that. But allyship for non-Asians and non-Africans, what does that look like? I think one thing that I wanted to speak about is, I guess, the wider Africa-China space, academic and outside of that, whether it's media. You know, there is, and we've seen the start of several initiatives to kind of diversify the voices that are platformed and amplify voices of African descent, be they American with organizations such as the Black China Caucus, or be they African such as platforms as our own. And, you know, I think because sometimes the dominant voices in digital spaces on social media don't belong to the community, I think in terms of showing support to said communities, or being very careful and understanding that when communities do not have as large platforms to have voices for their own, you have to be careful in the optics of the things that you say. Because if you have a platform that is named in a certain way, that for those who are not in the Africa-China space, they might assume that you have a proximity to said community, or that you belong to said community. If you put forward a certain opinion as the narrative, then sometimes what ends up happening is that voices from within said community end up being cancelled almost. And it's not always reflective of how people actually feel. And I've seen this play out several times. I think there's not much more. This is the last one. Yeah. So I just wanted to mention the future I think one thing that I've seen, and I think I mentioned it earlier, so I'll go through this really quickly, but the work of people such as Kenti and Silk are really, really important, again, because they do bridge those gaps and they are doing the work. And also they stress African agency. And I think this is something really important. They often give a platform to Africans in the media industries, in the music industries, cultural industries, to show how what Professor Adams, I think, has termed it, like African soft power plays out, and how members of the wider African diaspora are really using their time within China to change the narrative and ensure that time spent in China or engaging with China is beneficial both to community, individual, and wider continent. And I think this is worth more study beyond even Guangzhou. So yeah, I'll stop there. There is more that I wanted to say, but I'm aware of time, so I'll stop